Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Scenario Planning Best Practices for a Changing Economic Climate. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, then we'll dig into our presentation. First, we'd like to thank Bill for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful thought leadership partners to Argyle, and they're committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. Thank you again to Bill. We appreciate you joining us today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum. I also wanted to take a minute to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. Argyle is very proud and protective of this policy, as it reflects our commitment to ensure the neutrality and overall value of the content presented at our events. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our member support of this policy. For anyone who's seeking CPE credit today, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and remain on the session for its duration. Polls can be found under the Polls tab on the right-hand side of your console, right next to Chat. Afterwards, if you're eligible to receive credit, you will receive an email with a link to your certificates. If you have any questions about credits, please email cpe@argyleforum.com. Finally, and most importantly, please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Before we start, I'd like to have our speakers introduce themselves, and then we'll begin our discussion. Priya, can we start introductions with you, please?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Hi, my name is Priya Gupta. I am the VP of FP&A at Archer Aviation. Archer is an eVTOL company. I've been in FP&A, financial planning and analysis, for over 15 years, primarily in the Bay Area. So I am based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. So before Archer Aviation, I spent about 10 years in the clean tech industry. So thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. Dan, can we continue introductions with you, please?
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Eric. I'm Dan Manutier. I'm the VP Finance at Life360. I've been here for about 3 years. B2C company, the family safety app. Excited to get in that industry. I've spent over 20 years running around the Silicon Valley, working mostly in software, helping companies grow up, get through their IPO, get mergers, acquisitions, et cetera, as they all go through their maturation process from startup to fully fledged mature companies. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's begin with our first question, and I'd like to call everyone's attention to our first poll, which will be on the right-hand side of your screen there. So our first question is, what are some differences between scenario planning and forecasting? Dan, can you please take the lead on this question?
Sure. So at least my experience, when I think of scenarios as being a what if, and just it's a quick question that comes up. Somebody asks, well, what if something were to happen? What if we lost a contract? What if we modified a contract? What would the impact be on, let's say, the current quarter? And whereas forecasting is we're trying to look at, it's much more in-depth and detailed in terms of building up what we see happening for the year. I'll talk about 3 things that come to my mind: is scenarios, forecasting, and budgeting. Budgeting is what you historically do once a year. It gets set, it gets locked. Forecasting and then the updates to the budget that we do the monthly. Every month we do a full year reforecast. And that's bottoms up, looking through all the GL accounts, all the spend, all the revenue, et cetera, trying to figure out what we think the year is really going to look like. Whereas scenarios are these what ifs where somebody has an idea, CFO, C-level, C-suite person thinks, what if we try this? What if we do that? And you're just trying to figure out a quick, high level, light touch impact to the company, the quarter, the year, et cetera, for that. So that's kind of how I think about the differences. For me, Priya, you may have a different view.
Sure. I think for the most part, right, I think that is an important difference to highlight, that forecasting is a more structured tool. It is, again, the annual budget in the beginning of the year, very detailed, and you follow up with a cadence, a very structured cadence throughout the course of the year. We do it on a quarterly basis. Again, like every quarter, you go through the rhythm of doing a forecast, which is, again, very bottoms up. The key difference, at least in my experience, has been that forecast is based on a base set of assumptions, right? So you understand and you baseline the business to say, here is what we're driving the business to. And from those assumptions, right, whatever those assumptions are, program schedule, volume, cost roadmaps. That set of assumptions forms the base for the forecast or that plan that's put together. Scenario planning, again, is a what if, or I think of it more as a management of risks and opportunities tool, which is, again, at the beginning of the year, if we're saying, I understand that we're locking in our budget or we're locking in our forecast, assuming that volume is going to grow 10%, but what if it grows 20%? Or what if it actually drops? Then what does our business look like? And in a scenario in which our business has, if for whatever reason volume drops, how do you want to manage that risk of it? So it's a more of a discussion tool to help people understand what are the different various, again, risks and opportunities your business can be faced with, and how do you plan for that, or at least how do you provide visibility to that, so you are thinking ahead and not catching up in the last moment when those end up getting realized over the course of time. So I'll
Great,
pause.
thank you.
Thanks.
Continue with our next question. And that is, what details, including details about payables and receivables, are essential for scenario planning? Priya, can you lead us off on this question, please?
Sure. So scenario planning, has multiple components. I generally look at any planning or forecasting activity as having two big ones, which is how much money is coming in and how much money is going out, right? So cash in, cash out, or revenue and cost. So for those large components, payables and receivables are sort of a part of that. So when I go back to, again, how much money is coming in, it can be from a lot of different avenues, and receivables, which is how much money the customers are giving you as a part of it. The other elements could be things like financing. Are we raising equity? Are we raising debt? Is there any other grants that are coming in? Are there any tax credits? So there's multiple elements of, again, cash in, and receivables is a part of that. And that is usually a very, very large part of it, at least in companies that are revenue generating. And on the flip side, of course, payables is tied to how much money the company is spending, right? And the balance between that helps you plan either how much money you have to raise or what do you do with the operating profit your company has. So, and beyond payables, I think the other thing to keep in mind as you plan for cash going out, at least in my experiences, depending on how we're capturing it here, is the largest expense for a company ends up being headcount, which is payroll driven. So, and that's typically not captured in payables. So that's at least how I think scenario planning and payables and receivables play hand in hand. Bill?
Dan, what do you think? How does this answer play out at your company?
So when I think of scenario planning for a company that is a little more mature, the key drivers aren't necessarily what's going to be for payables and receivables versus what's doing to the P&L. But so different companies at different life cycles, when they're doing scenario planning, for instance, the number one thing they're looking for is, what does this do to my cash balance? How long does this extend my runway? Because that's the biggest thing that's important to me versus, let's say, my top line or my bottom line. As you move forward and you've given guidance, then of course, if your guidance includes cash balance, you've got to keep thinking about what levers do you need to pull to hit that with what the impact of your scenario that you just run through looks like. So something you may run a scenario says it's going to extend your receivables, so you need to extend your payables to align to get that cash balance where you want it to land. On the other hand, you may also have bank debt, which provides covenants, and you got to think about your covenants, which will probably include a cash impact, and so you want to make sure that you're going to pass your covenants thresholds that you need to clear at the end of the period. So are you focusing on revenue here? You're focusing on bottom line? Are you focusing on covenants, cash balance, and if you need to, what can you pull in or push out on either receivables or payables to get to land where you need to get to, depending upon your scenario.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what's the interactions between your payables and receivables function and your scenario planning function? Dan, why don't you take the first swing at this, please?
Well, again, kind of those are the levers that you can play with to achieve certain targets that you're trying to get with. And particularly if you're trying to, let's say you're in a position where cash is king at this point, you're not so primarily focused on revenue. You'd look at your customer, you'd look at when your payables would normally be scheduled to go out and your receivables, and depending upon how tight you are, we all hear about scenarios where everybody meets every week to figure out if there's enough cash to cover payroll. So your scenarios then are going to be look at what can you do to, who can you extend and who can you pull in on the, who can you extend on payables and who can you pull in on the receivables. I fortunately haven't spent a whole lot of time in that in that scenario, but when you see something potentially happening to your largest customer and the impact on that cash balance that would have to you, then you need to perhaps go look on your payable side and say, who could you push out to compensate for the fact that something popped up with one of your largest customers. So it's, if you're trying to modulate those dials to get to your cash that you're looking for, those are the way I look at those two things. And sometimes you can call in favors with customers if you have a really good relationship to get them to pay early. And then you usually have a pretty good idea of which vendors you can extend out for a little bit that would not be problematic. So those are the things you always want to keep in mind when you're looking in detail at those things.
Priya, what do you think?
I think I agree for the most part, right? It depends a lot on what the stage of the company is. So if you're in a company where, again, cash is king and you're managing to goals, which is about cash, extending cash runway, then you do have to manage your receivables and payables function very tightly. If you're, for example, in a pre-revenue company, then again, receivables and payables, the interplay is limited because there's not much receivables to work with, right? So what you're doing is very actively managing just the payable side of your business and managing cash in through other sources by understanding what's the risk to your payables at any point in time. And on the flip side, if I take the scenario of a very large, company with a lot of commercial revenue, in that case, there's a situation in which cash is not the primary driver, right? Or cash balances, and you're worried more about what is the gross margin and what are the operating margins for the company. And then you're not managing the payables as necessarily tied to receivables, but more about, are we investing in the right place for the business? So I think it depends, for me at least, it's always just dependent on what stage the company is at and what are the goals associated with that life cycle that the company is in.
Great, thank you. This next question, Priya, I'd like to start with you. How do you determine what scenarios to plan for?
Sure, thanks. So I think scenarios are actually a very, very great tool for the company to go through, right? This planning exercise. So I usually break it up into two parts. One is, what are the external factors to a company that you should be aware of, that we should be planning for? So examples of external factors could be like right now in a time period like this, if we are in a sort of a recessionary environment, then access to capital is more limited. So how do you plan knowing that that is a scenario we're walking into? The other external factor could be, when COVID hit us and then there was a lot of supply chain disruptions. So those are externalities that you have to think about, that what is going on in a macroeconomic climate that's going to impact our business, and pick a couple of different data points to plan your business around. The other element is, of course, your internal factors. And internal factors could be, how much bookings am I going to get, or customer engagement am I going to get? It could be around, again, if you're a R&D company, then it could be more about how many products am I launching? What is the time period in which I'm launching those products? How much spend is associated with it over time? So it ties back to, again, the phase of the company. But the starting point would, of course, be internal and external factors. And then you have to pick like 2 or 3 big risks associated with that, risks or opportunities associated with that. So for me, the prime examples, I'll give you our examples are, for a company, again, that's pre-revenue, the biggest ones, of course, are if you don't have a product, how long is it going to take? How much cash runway do we need to have? And then what are our sources for financing that? So one's internal, which is we control, okay, fine, how do you get a product to market as early as possible? And what are the different scenarios you can plan for if there's delays or acceleration of that? And then to achieve that, there's another Pareto, which is what would happen if you had access to financing, which was X million more or X million less, right? So that's a framework to look at when we're at least evaluating pre-revenue companies. In revenue generating companies, again, for me, the biggest driver, at least in my past experience, has been one, volume. How much volume are we going to get? And then what is the associated either pricing or cost reduction that we could generate with volume? So I'll pause with that. It would get to get your take as well.
Yeah, definitely. Dan, how do you determine what scenarios to plan for?
Well, I think that I kind of broke them down. I think the first thing is, like we talked about, is the macroeconomic environment. What is going on in the overall macroeconomic environment? Is our thoughts growth at all costs? I don't care. I just want to grow, because that's what we have. Money is cheap. Let's just go. We've seen those days. And then there's money is extremely tight, so we don't count on getting any more money. So we have to be able to survive and extend based on what we have right here, right now. So looking at the macroeconomic environment, then if you go down and think about your industry, is your competition coming out with additional products that you need to respond accordingly to? What's going on in the regulatory environment, if you are subject to it or not? Or then there's just the social trends are going in your favor or not in your favor, and what would be the impact of that on your company? And then in your particular company, you want to think about things, a scenario would be, this comes up with different people, different C-suite execs come up with all these ideas. I remember one company I worked at, it seemed like every Monday morning, somebody had a new idea that had to be run, and the scenario had to be run for. And so you were continuously running scenarios. An example would be, well, what if we raise prices? What is the impact of doing that? What if we launched a marketing program? What if we launched a new product? Everybody had a different idea of what you had to run all the time. So, and you can't, a scenario is not designed, in my view, to run all of those three different things that I just went through. A scenario is designed to quickly model one or two maybe variables, but not. An annual plan is where you're going to try to get everything, that all the strategic initiatives in it all at once. A scenario is not. It is quickly, you're on a runway on a certain path, and you're trying to see what one or maybe two variables would be on where you're going. So keeping that in mind is how I think about it. And then what's going on with major customers is another one. If you hear that a major customer has a problem, what is that going to do for you? How dependent upon your business are you for that one customer? And therefore, what would that be? Or a major supplier problem. If you've got a major supplier problem that's going to impact your ability to produce product and deliver, what is that going to do for you? So those are some of the things that come to my mind.
Great, thank you. Let's continue. What are some ways to scenario plan collaboratively with other areas of your business? And I would like to point out that the second poll is up on the right-hand side of your screen. Dan, can you start us off on this question, please?
Sure. So to scenario plan collaboratively with other areas of the business, that's a great question, because one of the things that comes to mind is that as I just went through, for instance, you're probably not going to find out about a customer problem quickly as a salesperson who manages that account. So they're the ones, the different parts of the business are going to have different inputs and insights, better insights, let's say, into what's going on. Operations, who handles the suppliers, we're probably going to be more so on the leading edge of what's going on with them. The sales team is going to be more so and have more insight in terms of what's going on the customers. And if you want what's going on in the product development and delivery deadlines, that's always over in the engineering side of the house, let's say. So each one of those are key people that you're going to want to get in front of and talk to figure if you're trying to plan a scenario, or they may be coming to you with a scenario but you need the input from them to figure out the subtleties of how to think through the problem or question to come up to model the scenario appropriately. So thinking through getting their input is going to be invaluable, and then they're along for the ride with you. You're not. It's not you versus them. You're working collaboratively together to come up with a combined solution that we can all agree with. And then if you need to take that scenario to the broader C-suite, let's say, you've already got an ally because you built it together with them for that particular item that you just went through.
Great, thank you. Priya, how does this work at Archer Aviation?
So I think it's very similar. I didn't want to say exactly that, but it was very well put together, Dan. So it is a very, very collaborative effort. So the question is, how do you do it, and how do you parcel down that if you've got a company of 500 employees, which ones do you engage with, right? So I think that kind of becomes my thought process here is more like, first you have to understand as a business, which are the areas that are impacted by things changing, right? So at Archer Aviation, at least, for example, we're a pre-revenue company. So it's a lot driven by the engineering companies. What are the risks or opportunities associated with that team? So it has to be an engagement effort with how is your program doing? Are there any technical issues, any regulatory issues that we should be aware of? And then plan scenarios around that. The other one, of course, is vendors. Do we have a good vendor base, a supplier base? Do we have any risks on vendor contracts that we should be aware of? Right, so very, very similar to, I guess, what Dan mentioned, but it's not done in a silo, of course, and it is done by at least understanding who are your key stakeholders in that process. And at least for us, again, depending on the maturity of the company, it changes. And at least my way of getting ahead of it is usually to have a pre-kickoff meeting, right? At least at the time of the budget setting or the forecast setting, in which we're able to understand cross-functionally what are everybody's key concerns. Once you hear everybody's key concerns, then at least they're on your radar that, okay, fine, engineering is on track, we don't have to worry about it, or no, I heard a little inkling of something could be happening and I need to keep my eye out for that. And then you develop check-ins. You develop check-ins on where the business is at. So I think from a financial standpoint, we add value by ensuring that we are good business partners to know where that risk is or that opportunity is in the business. But to actually deliver a scenario plan, it has to be a collective effort in which you're reaching out to the key stakeholders across your organization.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what are some ways that people can make their scenario planning adaptive to changing conditions? If you can't change your scenario planning as you go, that limits the usefulness of your scenario planning. Priya, can you lead us out on this question, please?
Sure, yeah. So scenario plans, I think, are meant to be, you at a point in time, you identify that what if something happened and how would you react accordingly? And then over time, at least in my opinion, scenario plans either need to mature into either a forecast, which is like, okay, fine, either those risks and opportunities have now been realized and they become part of your base plan, or you've retired them and that scenario plan is not valid anymore. So it doesn't have to be, or it's unlikely that a scenario plan exists in perpetuity, right? You have a scenario plan because you understand sometime in the future, we're going to be faced with a situation, right? Again, take the example that we're creating a scenario plan for, let's just say, a risk associated with the vendor. And then 3 months down the road, you realize that we actually signed a vendor contract and we don't have that risk anymore. So it's a very natural progression to say we don't need to do or use that scenario anymore, but the business could have additional risks that it's facing or opportunities that it's facing at that point in time. So you develop additional risk scenarios. So I think it's a maturity, which is like you continue to change that over time, just depending on where you are as a company.
Thank you. Dan, what do you think?
So Priya said it well, and along that vein is like you're starting out with it's kind of really vague out there. So there's storm clouds on the horizon of something, and you're just trying to put a quick model together to the scenario here to say what would happen if. And you don't have a lot of facts when you start with. You're just trying to put something together to see if this impact would be good. So you basically put some stakeholders in the sand in what you're modeling here at this point. But then as time marches on, and you're keeping your eye on this scenario, you should be getting more and more insight into how those variables are developing in terms of the risk to the business. So choose one, inflation. If inflation is an important factor, let's say, you have no idea what inflation is going to look like. The Fed is going to raise rates. How much, when, how, you're not really sure. You just start putting stakeholders in the sand. But then as time marches on, you get a better idea of what that would be. And it's a particular event. These scenarios are designed for one particular risk that you're looking at, or maybe two, but not more than that. So as time marches on, those storm clouds develop or don't, and you get better insight into exactly where you're going to, what the quantification of that risk would look like, and therefore its impact on the business. So you may run it a couple of times, but as we said, is at some point, Priya was putting it, you're going to put it into a forecast, where you've got further insight and development on it at that point where it's truly mature enough as a risk that you're putting it into the business. But you're gonna, it's that's how I see you adapt to it, because you get better insight on that one particular risk that you're looking at as time marches on and what you're trying to consider to de-risk.
Great, thank you. So this next question, let's start with Dan and then continue with Priya. What are the tools that are useful for good scenario planning?
Excuse me. So I think one other vector that you need to add into tools and scenario planning would be the maturation of the company. So clearly the basic one that everybody goes to start with would be Excel, and that's the quickest, dirtiest. If you want to just do something really back the envelope, quick and easy, and run with it, Excel is where you start. And then obviously, if you're at a multi-billion-dollar company, that's not going to work so well. So there are much more mature tools that would apply over there. And there's a variety of tools that are out there. But ones that, we use adaptive planning for our budgeting and forecasting over here, but we also use Causal, which allows us for more high level work that the company does. So those are two that come to my mind, and as well as the basic. Everybody answers everything with Excel, so that's not a hard one. But anyway, Priya, you may have other ideas though.
We actually do the exact same thing. So we use adaptive planning for budgeting and forecasting, but I'll talk about scenario planning also in parallel to that. So yes, you need a tool, right, for your base detailed forecasting, which is easy to roll up. Again, for smaller companies, it's easy to do it in Excel, but you always are massively concerned about, manual errors. But that is for, your bottoms up budget and forecast. However, when it comes to scenario plans, because they don't go as deep and they are more for what if X, Y, and Z happens, I think Excel is a great tool. However, I think I'd highlight that it depends on what risk is it that you're trying to quantify. So I'll give you an example of the ones that in some cases, I don't think that the SaaS-based tools really work well. For example, if you're trying to just come up with a scenario of raising money or financing or capital, like that doesn't have to go through a tool, right? That is a back of the envelope cash, just back of the envelope math to understand how much more incremental financing options exist from X, Y, and Z sources. So that is very easily done in Excel. However, if you had scenarios in which you wanted to understand the impact of different, let's just say, hiring plans or headcount plans, and you wanted to understand what is the quantified impact of that, I do think some of the tools like adaptive planning are very useful in going through that effort, because the results are a lot more accurate than going through that in Excel. And there are easy ways to create versions to manage those scenarios and lock those down and go back for reference points if needed.
Great, thank you. This next question, we'll have you take the first turn on. What are the differences between scenario planning and business continuity planning?
So scenario planning, as you mentioned, right, is looking into the future for risks that are risks or again opportunities that are sort of known at that point in time. So it is thinking a little bit longer term, right? It's not thinking about tomorrow, but it is thinking, okay, over the course of the next 1 year, what are the variables that can hit me? And how do I think about a strategy, or how do we all collectively at least have our eyes and ears open for a strategy to manage that? Business continuity planning, at least in my experience, has been more reactive and more short term, right? And the examples at least that come to my mind is, if there is, again, if your data is wiped out, and if you had, what would you do in that scenario? So that is more of a reactive plan, right? Which each individual function plans at their level for longer term business continuity, but that's not a corporate planning activity. So at least that's how I think about the difference. Scenario planning is a much larger corporate planning activity.
Thank you. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, scenario planning, very light touch, you're just trying to what if this and what if this, and you're on a path and you're just trying to see, do you need to take a turn to stay on your path, or is it really not going to impact you that badly? is what I'm is scenario planning, because and it's again not very much in depth, more driven high level variables and metrics is how you build it and look at it. Whereas yeah, what you've been hacked, you've had a data breach, your production system is down. Um, those are more how are you going to recover from that, and what is that going to look like? Those are more what I think about in terms of the business continuity. How major impacts to the business, which of course are different for different risks for different businesses. But when sitting down and thinking of it, you could probably come up with what the top 5 or 10 are, and then how you'd respond to that. So thinking and they don't change. Scenario planning is more of a dynamic goings on regularly throughout the time, whereas business continuity risks, and as I see it, they don't move that much. If you look at your business, the major business risks that you had at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, if you came up with 10 at the beginning of the year, at least 8 of those 10 are still going to be in play, in my opinion, at the end of the year. They just don't go in and out of your business that quickly. You may work on something to de-risk 1 or 2 of them, but these are heavy lifts to do so. So they wouldn't all move out or move in the year. So they would stay pretty set for a longer period of time. That's how I'm thinking about those 2 different items.
Continue. And Dan, this next question, let's have you take the lead on. Can you please explain the difference between using goal-specific scenario planning questions and non-goal-specific scenario planning questions?
Goal-specific scenario planning questions, I guess if I think of one, would be, okay, I have X amount of cash in my bank today. I've got a burn of Y. I can't count on getting any more money. I've got to make this land get me until, and I've got to make it up. It's going to be 18 months, 12 months, 24 months, whatever that is. So that's what I think of as the specific. Whereas a non-goal would be, what if this were to happen? What if I wanted to raise my prices somewhat? What would that do to the business? Raising your prices is going to, if you're a SaaS business, it's going to churn out customers. So how do you think about that? And what would that impact look like? Just in terms of your top line revenue, it would downfall into cash and the like. But more what if scenarios, as opposed to this is going to occur. How do I make it happen? How do I survive through it on the goal specific scenario questions? So we spend most of our time probably in the non-goal things, that what if this were to happen? What if that were to happen? What if we see this coming up, versus we do in we've got to survive on the cash that we have today. Of course, as a publicly traded company, that makes it perhaps a little different bucket than other companies. So that's kind of how things work. I think about those. Priya,
what do you think?
I'd say very similar experience, right? I think by definition, we're saying if it's a goal-specific scenario planning, right, your end goal with all of that is to figure out how do we meet our company goals. And then you understand what are the risks and opportunities, whatever that is. But at the end of the day, it is to manage to that same goal. So I agree with Dan that there's not eventually a scenario plan that's developed which is differing from, again, your company goals. It's essentially to just understand what are the other variables that could come in to go in and develop the base budget, right? So I think of it more as goal-specific scenario planning are more thinking activities, right? Okay, they're more thinking activities, but they don't end up leading necessarily to a different plan, or they don't end up leading, because I think it ends up becoming confusing for the business as well. If you say, hey, I've got goals for the company, I've got a budget for the company, but I'm also now going to give you these 2 or 3 other different scenarios that are going to be very disconnected from the goals of the company. So, and that's why the non-goal specific ones exist more so to understand, back to Dan's point, right? What are the different what ifs that the business wants to understand? And it creates a forum to just understand that, see what the impact is on those company goals, and create a thought process to manage those, so that we can understand whether the company goals as well as the base budget that has been developed is at risk or not. So at least that's how I think about it. Goal-specific scenario plans essentially should be very, very limited and should be managed to go away, ideally.
Cool, thank you. The next question is, how can people keep track of the assumptions that go into their scenario planning? Priya, can you please take the first swing at this?
Sure. So I think there is a two-part answer to that. One is it's back to the tools discussion that we had. So depending on which tools you are using for your scenario plans, there are ways to capture different assumptions. So if it's Excel for that matter, right, like I always recommend that everybody has like a key assumptions or a key drivers for the business that they highlight and keep track of. And then vary that so that you have a snapshot of what those key drivers or key assumptions are and what the changing assumptions are as in how you move from one scenario to the other. If you have tools like adaptive planning, they anyways come with pre-built global assumptions and they're easy to like lock down and copy and do different versions. Those are the more, I would say, tactical ways of finalizing and locking down. But those tools and those locking down of assumptions don't really necessarily translate to providing visibility to the larger teams, to the exec team, to the leadership team. So my recommendation always is that as in how you are presenting your scenario plans and you're presenting your budgets, you should always lead with what are the key assumptions behind a particular plan. And that should always be sort of memorialized in a document, right? If whether you're doing an internal presentation, whether you're doing a board presentation, but that's how it's not a great like, okay, fine, we've got something locked down in a tool, but it is a great way to communicate to the broader business of what that plan is based on. So it's not rocket science, but it is as simple as providing tools and a forum to communicate to your business with.
Great, thank you. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's goes. The words that come to my mind is good hygiene, because what's going to happen is, oh, it's great and easy as you are on the fly trying to build it, but the key is then to be able to go back and look at it and say, well, which scenario was this? What were we doing here? Because I modified it 5 times and I can't remember which one this was. You don't. That's the last place you want to be. So good hygiene, meaning good documentation and good archival. So you've clearly identified which one this is, and you can clearly find what you're looking for in there for it. It sounds easy, but when you think about all the Excel that we all have and run around with, we got to make sure that we have this in good places. And clearly ID, maybe color code, what have you, put it in one. What if you're doing Excel workbooks, put it all in one work tab to color code it, something so that you know that is the assumption. To start with, you're not going to, as I've said, in the way I think about it, is I'm not running 5 different variables. I'm trying to not have 15 different assumptions in what I'm building. It's to keep it relatively simple. You're going to start with a financial picture as of a certain point in time, and you got to make sure you've clearly identified what point in time you froze and started your financial position to then model it going forward in your scenario. And so making sure that that's clearly identified, just clear. It's easy to do it quick and dirty, but then you've got to pretty it up so that you can look at it later and make sure that you understand it and somebody behind you can follow and find it. Because otherwise it just becomes a bear later on. So particularly when you've got other people that are involved in working with that scenario too. And then as well said was by Priya, is when you put it into the presentation mode and you're now presenting it to other around the company, they've got to understand how you thought about the problem you're about to present to them, or the solution potential solution you're providing, but what went into that, so they know that what it does or does not consider. That's how. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let's continue. What should you do when one or more of your scenario planning assumptions turns out not to be true? Dan, can you start this one, please?
So if I go back to how I think about that, as I challenge the question to say to myself, if the point is you start with a scenario and then as those storm clouds develop, I'm refining my scenario, I should be getting very, very close and then moving into a forecast, et cetera, to being actually correct, not because I'm brilliant at being able to predict the future, but that I've updated and modified enough as time goes on so that I'm like golf, I'm not close to the pin. It's just it's not my one scenario that I did on the first day, and wow, I really messed that up. My assumptions were way off, etc. Because the goal here would be I'm modulating those assumptions as time marches on, and those risks develop or don't develop, so that I by default land very close to reality. So that's the first thing that I walk through, is playing out the scenario and making sure that as it becomes more a reality, we're building more and more robust model towards it so when it occurs. Given the iterations as things develop, you're likely to be really close to the mark. The key is the impact that any of those actions that need to be taken as a result. So you should be pretty clear on what needs to happen as a result of that scenario coming to fruition.
Priya, how about you?
I think I'll add to it, because I think everything that you mentioned is absolutely true, right? And I think we've talked about this already a little bit, that if something turns out not to be true or turns out to be true, what do you do with the scenario plan, right? It's two places. You retire that, and ideally it's matured into your forecast at some point in time. I think the question becomes that when it turns out not to be true, or the other way, I think you have to evaluate, are there other situations at hand that you should be evaluating at that point in time now, right? So is there something else that has changed in the business that we need to have our eyes and ears open for? Is it time for another scenario that we should be evaluating? And if so, ask the questions again. If something retires as a assumption that we use leading into a scenario plan, if we need to think differently. So beyond everything else you've talked about, I think that's the only thing that we have to it's a constant cycle, right? It's not going to be at one point in time. So it has to be a constant cycle of checking in on scenario plans, understanding what risk has matured, what risk has not, and then has been anything else come up which naturally would have made your previous scenario plan stale anyways.
Great, thank you. For this next question, I want to call everyone's attention to the poll on the right-hand side of your screen. And the question, which we'll have Priya lead off on, is: it's frequently very difficult for businesses to admit the need to change a key goal and then actually change it. What advice can you offer here for businesses that may be struggling with this?
So this, I think I mentioned to you, this is a very good question, right? And it's a very difficult one to deal with, because when there are goals that are set for the company, it's very difficult to just accept the fact that we're not tracking to it and that there is a need for a change. So I think my answer is three-part. One is, generally for a business, at least in my opinion, we should separate goal setting from performance management, right? So that at least helps you focus on setting really, really difficult goals. And as you set difficult goals, and if you achieve 80% of it, 90% of it, at least the conversation to say, how is that linked to individual performance, is separated out. So it helps the conversation that what happens if you did not achieve that goal, an easier conversation, right? So that's one, because, so that's one. The second one is, do you have the right tools to even track and provide visibility on how you are executing towards that goal or not? Do you have enough frequent checkpoints so that, for example, if you are behind on a particular goal, then it is in front of people on a very, very particular cadence, whether that's monthly, whether that's weekly, to say, this is how we're tracking to this particular goal. And if it shows up in red, blaring color for 5 weeks in a row, then you have to, as a leadership, address it, right? So there has to be a way to track and have visibility to it. And I think the third one is that you have to have a way to ask the question from a risk mitigation standpoint, that if this goal is not achieved, then what happens? And the earlier that conversation starts, the earlier it is to impact the change to that goal if needed. And the answer could be in multiple phases, that, okay, fine, if this goal is not achieved, then, you know, it could be that, oh, we've missed external expectations on a particular number. How do you deal with that? You deal with that by getting ahead of that from a communication standpoint, right? The answer could be, if I don't miss this goal, it really does not impact us externally, but it's about more our internal commitments. How do you get ahead of that? Again, I really think the answer ends up being on getting ahead on communication, but it is to have enough of a visibility over time so that it gets ingrained on how you are achieving or not achieving that goal. So it's a very difficult one, in my opinion. again, Dan, you may have different feedback on this, so I'd appreciate learning your thoughts as well.
No, that it's, yeah. If to your point of, if it's a key goal, then it's something that's being measured. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a key goal. And if it's, and one will see as they do their reporting throughout, think about it throughout the year, that we start out, you can always start, as you start out and you measure it against the benchmark, you can see that you're not, whatever this goal is not being delivered, and we're not getting to it, achieving it as we see it coming together, period after period after period, because the actuals are the actuals where we're measuring that thing, and assuming that we're measuring it correctly, it's going to take us back to the assumptions at some point, because at the beginning there's always going to be a great reason why period 1 we missed it, period 2 yes, period 3 maybe there's something going on, etc. But as we go on over time, it becomes obvious that we're not going to get there. And the why of what, was it the wrong goal? Did we think, was it too much of a stretch goal? Is just, how are we thinking about it, and what actually was coming to fruition? It becomes obvious over time that something is going on, and the collectivity there shouldn't be over time too much people putting their head in the sand to not understand that we're missing this goal, and therefore how are we going to? Yep. Oh, we're gonna make up for all of that in the December, the end of the year. We're going to catch up with that, this massive miss that we are 6 months in. We're going to make all up for in December. It's like, can we really believe that? Can you really tell that to the board with a straight face? Going to be pretty hard. So getting that in, which goes back to then the reporting of getting the information out on the metrics, the key goals, the monthly package of the reporting needs to be in there, and it needs to get distributed so that everybody is seeing how this is coming together or not, so that we can take the collective action that we need to do, change the goal, change something we're doing to achieve the goal, what have you. So I guess the key is to get to the point so people all collectively say, yeah, we got to do something about this goal. It's pretty clear that something, we're probably not going to get there, so we need to get it. As hard as, you're going to have egos on the line at this point, because people who were vested into it to set that goal, and that's something that's a psychology question we can spend some time on if we'd like. But nonetheless, it's putting it front and center and how we're going to deal with it so that it doesn't become a surprise coming out of the blues. I think what we were all trying to say here.
Thank you. So our next question is, how can you capture the insights and recommendations that come out of the scenario planning process and turn them into institutional knowledge from your business? In other words, how do you learn from this? Dan, can you lead off on this, please?
So when you're running your scenarios, again, you're trying to see the what ifs, and if they come to fruition, they help you because you're taking just stakes in the sand to run your scenario of what as we, like, for instance, inflation, you got to put a number in there, what you think it's going to be to figure out the impact to your business. You want to raise prices, you got to put a number in there. So you're putting some stake of what your numbers look like, and you're going to see over time how well you think about these things. And then if they really start coming into fruition, as we said, you're probably going to start building them into your forecasts, and then eventually into the budget for the following cycle. So when they mature and they come to fruition, you start just incorporating that into the next turns that you go through of these. So the whole goal is that you see that they're coming together. It wasn't we talked about earlier, which is I built a scenario, boom, I'm now going to put that in the budget for the year. You just don't do that. This is you build a scenario to say, this is what could happen if, and then you start seeing that come together, and you're going to play out that scenario again. And then as those things mature, you're going to see that you do need to address it and incorporate it into the business, in whichever part to which it is applicable. And you want to put it there so that we're now incorporating that, because it makes sense with what we see going on out in the outside world. So quick and dirty, as you see that you come to the realization, you have that concrete gut that this isn't just a what if, this is it is true, this is going to happen, we need to incorporate it. That's how I think about it. And we talked about archiving those. You don't keep them alive forever. Those that don't go anywhere, you just put aside, and you don't carry those forward in any way, shape, or form.
Great, thank you. Priya, what do you make of this last one?
I think just to add to what Dan said, right? Like I think how do you institutionalize the knowledge? One, I want to highlight an example that we recently just went through, and I think it'll be useful, right? Which is sometimes you start with scenarios, back to those what ifs that, and I'll take a very, very specific example right now, is that went through a lot of activities over the past where the business always plans for, as a base plan, right? That I'm going to be hiring, let's just say, 30% quarter over quarter or 50% quarter over quarter, whatever that number is, right? But they're always planning for an activity that you as a business will track to. And sometimes you don't even actually have scenarios around it. But over time, you have actuals that come in, right? And they're consistently more like, okay, you've achieved 20% quarter over quarter of headcount growth or whatever that particular metric is. So the question becomes, after having gone through that 2 or 3 times in a row, what do you do with that information? And for me, the institutional knowledge comes from measuring that, right? And what we did recently was to say, okay, fine. When we last did our particular forecast cycle, this is what the business told us as a planning assumption. This is where we landed. Then we went through it again in, let's just say Q4. This is what the business told us. This is where we landed, right? So highlight the gaps so that then you can understand what those gaps are to influence your future planning to say, now I see that you're planning for 40% quarter-over-quarter growth again. It's not going to happen, right? So let's use or firstly provide data back to the business to understand that, okay, fine, how has our different plans measured up against our actuals or measured up against whatever the performance has been, the real actual performance has been. Create some way to communicate that, right? And the easiest one is, of course, a performance to actual sort of slide. And then institutionalize that by actually putting it into your base plans going forward and not creating scenarios around that constantly. So that's the one very specific example I would like to highlight, because I think there are multiple versions of those that happen all the time, that we plan for scenarios that don't really even need to be scenarios, because that should just be better hygiene of forecasting. So that's one example, but how do you put that into your better hygiene of forecasting is by measuring whether those, how has the business performed against 1 or 2 of those scenarios.
Great, thank you. So let's change the channel a little bit and open up the webinar to questions from the audience. I encourage you to submit your questions using the chat feature. So why don't we just jump in and start? The first question is, what's the biggest mistake you've seen companies make in their scenario planning, and how did they get past it? Dan, can you start with that one, please?
I think the biggest one is planning for too many scenarios. I shared with you earlier that I was in a situation before where it was every Monday morning, it was the scenario of the week. That we really shouldn't just be playing with so many variables all the time, that we're just never going to get anywhere. So getting it, and to me, that's a maturation of the organization comment. And the organization needs to just get more mature and not be wandering around worrying about every single scenario all the time, to the extent, because then you're deploying resources. Scenarios don't get built by themselves. You are mobilizing people and resources to make this happen. So something else is not getting done. So you want to do this when it's appropriate to do it, and find that right balance of when you need to do a scenario and say that one really isn't worth worrying about. So that is a managing upward comment, perhaps to some degree, but that's the one mistake that I've seen that just consumes resources for no great value to the organization.
Priya, what do you think?
I was going to say exactly the same thing, and my comments were exactly that. There was a scenario of the day and a scenario of the week. And what that led to, again, is of course the resource skill, but also lack of alignment, right? Because then all you're doing is doing scenarios and you never lock on assumptions to lock down what are you going to actually measure yourself to. And then our budgets got delayed, things didn't lock down. So it also creates an unhealthy habit in the company in which people think that your base plans can keep changing all the time. So scenario planning is meant to be to address key big risks, right? It has to be a variable, it's like 2 or 3 variables and 1 or 2 sets of assumptions associated with those 2 or 3 variables, not like a changing the dial every one point every day and then seeing what that does. That's not what scenario planning activity is based on. So I think that's where it's a business maturation topic, but also level setting with the C-suite on, okay, fine, what are you really concerned about? And let's address that through scenario planning.
Thank you. The next question is, we are struggling to get started with scenario planning. Do you have any advice for us? Priya, can you lead off with the advice?
Sure. So I would say first, keep it simple. If you complicate something too much, it's difficult to get it done. So I'm not sure what the current situation is, but again, I'd say if it's a tools thing, keep it in Excel. If it's a people thing, then get your at least key leadership in a room and discuss it. It depends on the size of the organization as well, but at least in my opinion, right, you have to get, because scenario planning is such a collaborative effort, and as finance folks, we don't know everything that's going on in the organization, so you almost have to call a meeting, have an open conversation with your key leadership, talk to them about, okay, what keeps you up at night, and where do you see opportunities, take a poll on that, right, bucket it, and then go from there to collectively agree on 3 or 4 key things that you want to do scenario planning on. We cannot do this in isolation, and we cannot complicate it. At least that's my high level advice as a starting point. And then you can mature from there.
Dan, how about you?
Kind of the devil's advocate on that is, don't worry, it's going to happen, but it's gonna come. Do you really want? Do you need to push it earlier? I guess that depends on your organization, but it has to start at some point. You have to start playing that game of getting into that mode of trying to think through things that are coming down the pipe, potentially coming down the pipe at you. So if you started to draw one up, working with 1 or 2 key people in the organization. If one really wanted to kick that off, that's how you do it. Is I get with somebody and say what risks that if one comes up, one can even in discussions that we're having, budget versus actual would be a great time having those meetings. Something comes up as a risk in that discussion, you run out, you do a scenario planning and get people's feedback on it. That would be one way to kick it off. If you really wanted to open up that exercise path, it's getting people on board to understand. Trying to get people on board to understand that you're just thinking through the macro scenarios that can come and really impact the company's business. Okay.
Great, thank you. Let's take time for one last question, and that's, how do you think the scenario planning function is going to evolve over the next couple of years? First, Dan, and then we'll close with Priya.
Over the next couple of years, I see that there are many tools that have come out there. I don't know if there's going to be a doubling of the number of the tools. Do we need twice as many as we have out there of tools to work with? But there'll probably be a couple more out there. But Excel's not going away, hasn't yet. The understanding what is going on in the macro environment that continues to change and evolve, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of changes in the scenario planning function in the next couple of years from where I sit in the company. We do it. We have a pretty good balance of when we do and we don't do it with the cycles that we went through, that we do a full forecast every month. So I'm not seeing the need for lots of scenarios to come into play. So I see it kind of holding steady as for the next couple of years from where I'm sitting.
Priya, how about you?
I would agree as well. I think it's more about the tools, because if I look at it, right, there's been so many more SaaS-based tools that have come up. There's AI and ML tools that have started influencing the financial planning tools. So there's probably better software that's going to present itself to us over the next couple of years. If that helps with scenario planning or not, as we talked about, some scenarios are very simple Excel and very back of the envelope math scenarios as well. So they may or may not actually end up impacting scenario planning function in isolation. They will definitely help, in my opinion, on your base budgeting and forecasting to make it easy for users and thus getting buy-in. But when it comes to more of the macroeconomic or company dynamics, I don't think there's anything happening, at least that I see over the next 2 years, that's suddenly going to say that, okay, it's going to be a function that picks up massively. I think it's going to be a very independent decision for each company and based on how they're going to mature through their life cycle. And if you're younger and then you're going through cycles of maturity, if you're suddenly private and you go through a activity of becoming public, so those activities of how a business grows was probably going to impact a scenario planning function more than overarching trends within a 2-year macroeconomic world.
Great, thank you. And thank you both, Dan and Priya, for this amazing discussion. And thanks everyone in the audience for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.